It was supposed to be a routine meeting. Just another negotiation between two of the world's biggest companies, set to finalize a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But what happened in that room would shock everyone, and later make headlines for all the right reasons. They thought they knew her. They thought they had the upper hand. But they were about to learn how wrong they were. Her name was Angela Chin. She wasn't just any CEO. She was one of the few black women at the helm of a Fortune 500 company, and her reputation for intelligence, precision, and quiet strength preceded her. Yet, despite all of her accomplishments, the room she walked into that day was filled with people who underestimated her in ways that were both blatant and subtle. From the moment she arrived, she could feel the tension, the unspoken assumptions floating in the air like a thick fog. The executives across the table barely looked at her as an equal. They whispered, joked, and even gave her a nickname behind her back. They called her servant. Yes, a word that would make anyone pause. In their minds, she was just another assistant, someone who belonged in the background. It was a label they threw around casually, assuming she couldn't understand the language, the culture, or the power dynamics at play. They didn't realize they were sitting across from a woman who spoke multiple languages fluently, including Chinese, the very language that would soon turn the entire negotiation upside down. Angela had spent years building her career, navigating corporate ladders that weren't designed for people like her. She had faced subtle discrimination, overt sexism, and occasional racism, all of which she handled with the kind of grace that came from knowing her own worth. But today was different. Today wasn't about patience. Today was about showing that competence, intelligence, and confidence couldn't be ignored or belittled. The meeting started just like any other. Papers shuffled, presentations clicked to life, and numbers filled the screen. But there was a subtle undercurrent, almost like a game, as the executives tried to assert control. They assumed she was inexperienced with international business, unprepared for the nuances of cross-border deals. What they didn't know was that Angela had spent weeks preparing, studying every clause, analyzing every number, and most importantly, learning exactly how to turn their own assumptions against them. As the discussion moved forward, the tone in the room shifted. The executives made offhand comments, mocking her understanding of key points. They underestimated her, thinking that her calm, composed demeanor meant she lacked influence or authority. But Angela had a secret weapon, her ability to communicate in Mandarin, a skill they assumed was irrelevant in this context. They didn't know that behind her calm smile, she was already calculating the perfect moment to change the course of the meeting entirely. She listened. She nodded. She asked questions that sounded polite but were carefully designed to expose gaps in their strategy. Every word, every pause, every glance was intentional. The executives were too busy underestimating her to notice the shift. And then it happened. The moment that would flip the negotiation on its head. Angela switched effortlessly to Chinese. Not just a few words, but full sentences, nuanced, precise, and deliberate. The room fell silent. Some of the executives froze, realizing too late that they had misjudged her abilities completely. The language barrier they assumed existed had never been there. Angela had been speaking their language all along, literally and metaphorically. Suddenly, the power dynamic changed. She began pointing out inconsistencies in the deal, clauses that were unfair, and risks they hadn't considered. The executives who once laughed at her were now scrambling to respond, but she was always 2 steps ahead. Every move they had planned to dominate the negotiation was now being turned against them. It was clear to everyone in the room that Angela was not just capable, she was brilliant. And then came the moment that would make headlines. The $700 million deal, which they thought was a sure thing, was no longer guaranteed. With a calm but unwavering voice, Angela made a decision that stunned everyone. She canceled the deal. Not because of impulse, but because she had seen through every weakness, every misstep, and every assumption that had led them to think they could manipulate her. The executives were speechless, the room filled with tension, disbelief, and a quiet realization that they had seriously underestimated her. What happened next was a mix of chaos and respect. Some executives tried to recover, attempting to renegotiate on their terms. Others quietly accepted that they had been outmaneuvered by a CEO who had quietly been planning this exact outcome. And Angela? She walked out of the room with the same calm demeanor she had when she entered, knowing that she had not just protected her company, but also sent a powerful message about respect, intelligence, and the danger of underestimating someone based on race, gender, or assumptions. The story of that day spread quickly. Headlines focused on the surprise, the canceled deal, and the sheer audacity of her actions. But the deeper story, the one that truly mattered, was about breaking stereotypes and challenging assumptions that had held back so many talented leaders. Angela didn't just make a business decision. She made a statement about power, presence, and identity in the corporate world. And yet, even as the world celebrated her victory, there was an unanswered question that lingered in the minds of everyone who had been in that room. What would happen next? How would the executives recover from being outsmarted so completely? And what new strategies would Angela employ, now that she had shown her full strength? In the next part of the story, you're going to see just how far Angela is willing to go when faced with underestimation, prejudice, and high-stakes decisions. The canceled $700 million deal was just the beginning. What followed would not only redefine her company's future but also challenge the assumptions of everyone watching, and make a lesson that no one in that room would ever forget. Because in the world of business, as in life, the people who are underestimated the most are often the ones capable of the most extraordinary moves. Angela Chin had just proven that, and what comes next would shock the corporate world in ways no one saw coming. Emptied, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had changed, but inside the walls of Angela Chen's office, every detail of that meeting replayed in her mind. She wasn't celebrating yet, not because she doubted her choice, but because she knew the fallout was just beginning. Decisions like the one she had made never existed in a vacuum. To understand why canceling that $700 million deal was so shocking, you had to understand the journey that had brought her to this moment. Angela hadn't been born into privilege. She had grown up in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and expectations for someone like her were even lower. From a young age, she learned to listen more than she spoke, to study more than she played, and to see patterns where others only saw chaos. Her parents worked multiple jobs, but they always emphasized one lesson above all. Intelligence and perseverance could create paths where none seemed to exist. By the time she reached college, Angela was already exceptional. Not just in academics, but in her ability to navigate spaces where she was often the only black woman in the room. That skill became her superpower. She learned to read people, to understand not just what was said but what was unsaid, the intentions, the assumptions, the subtle biases hiding in polite smiles and nods. In corporate boardrooms, that skill would later become her greatest weapon. After graduating, she faced the world head-on. Promotions came slowly, not because she lacked talent, but because doors often opened for others first. She had to knock on them repeatedly, armed with evidence, results, and a stubborn belief that competence couldn't be ignored forever. Along the way, she developed a quiet resilience that became as much a part of her as her sharp mind. By the time she reached the CEO position she held today, Angela had learned two crucial lessons. First, never underestimate anyone, and second, never let anyone underestimate you. Her journey wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. Angela's connection to her cultural heritage played a role in her strategy, her identity, and, surprisingly, in her ability to negotiate. Growing up, she had spent summers visiting relatives in China, learning the language, the customs, and the ways in which business was conducted across borders. Many of her peers in the corporate world dismissed her knowledge as irrelevant or quaint. Yet that very knowledge became the edge that no one could anticipate in today's meeting. Speaking Chinese wasn't just about language, it was a declaration that she was global, adaptable, and always prepared. Meanwhile, the executives who had labeled her servant were still reeling. In their arrogance, they hadn't considered that her calm demeanor might conceal a mind capable of seeing every angle, every potential mistake, and every hidden opportunity. They had assumed that racial and gender biases could cloud their judgment to their advantage. But Angela had turned those biases against them, exposing a vulnerability they hadn't known existed. Back in her office, Angela reflected on their behavior. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expected. Her anger would be quiet, methodical, transformed into strategy. Each misstep they had made, each moment of underestimation, was a lesson she could use. She knew the corporate world was full of people like them, people who believed in shortcuts, who believed that power could be assumed without earning respect. And she also knew that showing strength too early often provoked backlash. Timing was everything. Even now, as the initial shock faded, Angela was aware that this moment was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The canceled deal wasn't an isolated event, it was a statement, and statements like this rarely go unnoticed. Rival companies would analyze her decision, competitors would speculate about her strategy, and insiders would debate what her next move might be. Some would admire her courage. Others would resent it. But everyone would be watching. And there was another layer to the tension, her own team. Angela had built a diverse, talented executive team that trusted her implicitly. Yet she also knew that not everyone shared her vision or could handle the pressure of decisions on this scale. Some would celebrate the victory, while others might worry about the repercussions. Leadership, she knew, wasn't just about making the right decision, it was about ensuring the people who followed you were prepared for what came next. That balance was delicate and it required constant attention. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and advisors, each one a reminder that the world outside the boardroom was moving faster than she could. Analysts were already predicting stock fluctuations, journalists were sniffing out the story, and social media would soon explode with opinions, both informed and uninformed. Angela had learned to ignore the noise when necessary, but she also understood its power. In the age of instant information, perception often carried as much weight as reality. Even as she strategized, Angela couldn't ignore the human element of the situation. The executives across the table had assumed superiority, but they were still people capable of error, pride, and reaction. How they responded to being outmaneuvered could create opportunities, or dangers. And Angela knew that in business, human emotions were just as critical as numbers on a spreadsheet. Misjudge them and a company's future could change overnight. The tension wasn't limited to the corporate world. Angela's decision rippled into her personal life as well. Friends and family had watched her prepare for this negotiation, knowing the stakes were astronomical. Some had been anxious, fearing she might be taken advantage of. Others had quietly admired her confidence, knowing that her patience and planning were unmatched. Yet, even with their support, Angela understood the loneliness of leadership, the burden of being the person who must make the final call, the one whose choices shape the destiny of a company, a team, and sometimes even an industry. And then there was the unspoken mystery in the room, the question of intent. Why had the executives assumed they could dismiss her so easily? What past experiences had led them to believe that labels and assumptions could overpower competence? Angela didn't have answers yet, but she sensed that uncovering these motivations could be key to her next move. Understanding the mindset of those who underestimate her might be as important as the deal itself. Angela leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the city skyline outside her office window. The lights of the skyscrapers shimmered like stars, reminding her that this world was vast, full of challenges and opportunities alike. She could feel the weight of the canceled deal but also the energy it created, a chance to reset, to recalibrate, and to plan the next chapter with precision. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of how far she had come and how much further she could go. The room outside was empty, the city outside oblivious, but Angela knew one thing for certain: the story was far from over. The executives she had outmaneuvered would regroup, strategize, and possibly retaliate. The corporate world would take notice, and whispers about her abilities, her strategy, and her next move would ripple across industries. And Angela, calm yet relentless, would be ready, because she had already been thinking 3 steps ahead. As the night deepened and the city lights flickered, one question lingered in everyone's minds, though no one in the room had dared to ask aloud. What would Angela Chin do next? And how far was she willing to go to protect her company, her vision, and her people? In that quiet tension, the real story began. Not the canceled deal, not the whispered insults, but the game of strategy, skill, and patience that would define Angela's next move. The world thought it had seen her power, but they hadn't even scratched the surface yet. This keeps the suspense high, builds her backstory, deepens the characters, and expands the mystery and tension without resolving anything. The morning after the canceled $700 million deal, the corporate world was buzzing. News outlets had caught wind of the story, and analysts scrambled to interpret what had happened, spinning theories about why Angela Chen had pulled out at the last moment. In offices across the city, executives whispered her name, some with admiration, others with disbelief, and a few with barely concealed resentment. Inside her company, Angela's team was gathered in a quiet conference room, the air thick with curiosity and tension. Her CFO, a sharp-eyed strategist named Marcus, broke the silence first. "Angela, I need to know, do you expect any backlash? From the investors, from the other company?" His voice was cautious, measured, as if trying not to trigger her impatience. Angela shook her head slightly, her calm face betraying none of the emotions swirling inside. "Backlash is inevitable," she said, her voice steady. "But if we handle it right, this isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. We've just shown the world that we don't accept deals that compromise our integrity or our standards. That alone changes the conversation." Her assistant, a young woman named Lila, chimed in. "But some of the executives from the other company, they called you servant." "Do you? I mean, Are we expecting them to respond aggressively? There was a hesitation in her tone, the unspoken fear of retaliation lurking behind her words. Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but with focus. They underestimated me once. That won't happen again. But we need to be prepared for every scenario. If they come back, they'll come back hard. And we need to be smarter, faster, and more strategic. Meanwhile, across town, the executives Angela had just outmaneuvered were trying to make sense of their humiliation. The whispers they had used so casually now felt like a trap. One of them, a senior negotiator named Richard, slammed his hand on the desk. How did she do it? She spoke Chinese. She saw everything we were trying to hide. His voice was a mixture of frustration and awe. Others in the room avoided eye contact, the realization dawning that their assumptions had been their greatest weakness. Back at Angela's company, a secondary tension simmered. A group of junior executives were divided in opinion about her decision. Some saw it as a brilliant move, proof of Angela's unmatched strategic mind. Others worried that canceling such a high-profile deal might send the wrong message to investors or partners. The debates were heated but respectful, highlighting just how human the stakes were. This wasn't a board game, and every decision could ripple through careers, finances, and reputations. While the corporate chessboard played out in her office, Angela herself was already thinking several moves ahead. She reviewed the clauses she had flagged in the contract, each one a potential risk that had justified her decision. She considered how the other company might respond publicly, how the media could distort the story, and how her own team could leverage this moment for growth and protection. She didn't rush these thoughts, every detail mattered. In the days following the meeting, another subplot emerged, one that Angela hadn't entirely anticipated. A journalist, known for digging into corporate stories, had taken a particular interest in her background. Headlines began to appear online, highlighting her identity as a black female CEO and her ability to navigate international business with fluency in multiple languages. The coverage was largely positive, but Angela sensed an underlying tension. Some articles celebrated her brilliance, while others subtly questioned her methods or motives. The narrative could be shaped in multiple ways, and she knew that perception often carried as much weight as reality in the public eye. Even her competitors couldn't ignore the message she had sent. Rival companies began to reevaluate their strategies, particularly when dealing with high-stakes deals involving global markets. Angela's move had disrupted not just one contract but the expectations of how negotiations were conducted at the top level. Behind the scenes, she had become a silent force shifting the balance of power, though most people didn't yet fully realize it. Meanwhile, there were personal stakes that added another layer of complexity. Angela's family and close friends watched the unfolding drama from a distance. They understood the significance of her decision, but they also worried about the pressures she faced. The line between her professional persona and private life was thin, and every move she made had consequences beyond the boardroom. She felt the weight of that, yet she refused to let it influence her strategy. For Angela, leadership meant carrying the burden without letting it dictate the outcome. And then there was the other company's internal struggle, which played out in quiet, tense meetings. Richard, the negotiator who had first labeled her a servant, tried to rally his team, but he faced skepticism. Some colleagues feared that Angela's next move might strike again, using their own strategies against them. Others worried that conceding too much in public could damage their credibility. It was a storm of ego, strategy, and pride, all directed at someone who had proven she could see every angle before they even thought to consider it. Angela herself understood the human dynamics better than anyone. She knew that the executive's assumptions were based not just on bias but also on habits, overconfidence, and a sense of invincibility. Breaking through those layers required more than negotiation. It required psychological insight, patience, and the courage to act decisively. Every move she made was part of a larger game she had been studying for years, a game that extended far beyond one meeting or one deal. Yet, even with all her preparation, there were unknowns that kept her alert. She didn't know how far the other company might push, what legal maneuvers they might attempt, or how media narratives could influence investor sentiment. And she certainly didn't know which of her own colleagues might question her judgment under pressure. The tension wasn't just external, it was internal, a reminder that leadership meant navigating uncertainty at every level. As the week progressed, Angela began to explore additional strategies. She reached out to international partners, advisors, and analysts, not to negotiate immediately but to gauge the landscape. Every conversation was deliberate, every inquiry a way to map the future. She knew that the canceled deal had changed the game, but the full consequences wouldn't be clear for weeks, maybe months. The suspense was both exhilarating and dangerous. And all the while, the memory of being called servant lingered, not as anger but as fuel. It reminded Angela of how people judge others based on appearance, assumptions, and bias. It reminded her that the stakes weren't just financial, they were cultural, social, and deeply human. And it reminded her that the world often underestimates those who refuse to conform to expectations. By the end of the week, whispers about Angela's move had reached every corner of the business world. Some called it audacious. Some called it risky. But no one could deny it was brilliant. And yet, for Angela, none of it mattered unless it was part of a larger plan. The game was far from over. The canceled deal had created a tension that could explode in any direction. Every phone call, every meeting, every message could tip the balance. And Angela, calm and calculating, was ready for all of it. The story was no longer just about one deal or one insult. It had evolved into a complex web of strategy, bias, reputation, and human ambition. And somewhere in the background, a question hung over everyone involved. How far was Angela Chen willing to go to secure not just a victory but respect, influence, and the power to shape the rules themselves? No one had the answer yet. And that uncertainty, the tension of not knowing what she would do next, was exactly the force that kept everyone on edge. Just when it seemed the tension had reached its peak, Angela Chen's phone buzzed with an encrypted message she hadn't expected. She hesitated for a moment, reading the brief lines that appeared on the screen. They're planning something bigger. Prepare for the unexpected. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the recognition that the stakes were about to rise in ways she hadn't anticipated. Angela immediately called a private meeting with Marcus and her core leadership team. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. I just received information that suggests our competitors are not only regrouping, they're planning a move that could impact multiple contracts, not just the $700 million deal, she said, her voice measured but carrying weight. This isn't just negotiation anymore. It's a full-scale test of strategy, influence, and resilience. Her team exchanged nervous glances. Lila, always attuned to the undercurrents of tension, asked carefully, "Do we know what kind of move? Legal, financial, PR?" Angela shook her head. "Not yet. But whoever is behind this has studied us. They know our strengths, our vulnerabilities, and they're willing to push hard. That means we have to anticipate the unpredictable. Every decision from this point on must be calculated, deliberate, and ready for escalation." Meanwhile, across town, the rival company's executives were in a state of controlled panic. Richard had called an emergency meeting, furious that Angela Chen had outmaneuvered them once, and determined that they would regain control. But even within his team, there were conflicting opinions. Some suggested legal action, others hinted at aggressive media campaigns, and a few quietly questioned whether they had underestimated Angela to a degree they couldn't recover from. Back at Angela's office, she considered the human element, the unpredictable factor in every corporate battle. People were motivated not just by logic but by ego, fear, and ambition. She knew the rival executives' pride would make them reckless, their desire to regain face a potential weakness she could exploit. But she also knew that underestimating the lengths they would go to could be dangerous. Every chess piece in this game had the potential to strike unexpectedly. Just as Angela was analyzing the possibilities, another alert appeared, a news tip from an international market analyst. The article suggested that the canceled $700 million deal was causing ripples in overseas markets, and investors were questioning whether Angela's company was stable enough to handle future negotiations. The piece was subtle, almost casual in tone, but the implication was clear. The world was beginning to doubt her, even as she had gained respect. The convergence of these threats, the unknown moves of her competitors, media speculation, and investor uncertainty, created a pressure cooker environment. Angela's calm demeanor was the only anchor her team had, but even she understood the fragility of perception. One misstep, one misinterpreted signal, could trigger a cascade of consequences. And then came the real shock. Angela's assistant Lila discovered a leak within the company itself. A confidential strategy document had been accessed without authorization. The information wasn't public yet, but it suggested someone close to the negotiations might be feeding details to external parties. Trust, Angela realized, was suddenly as dangerous as the market. Her mind raced. A leak at this stage could give her competitors a roadmap to anticipate her moves, potentially undermining everything she had meticulously prepared. And yet, Angela refused to panic. She had navigated high-pressure situations before, relying on intelligence, instinct, and foresight. But this twist added a personal dimension to the conflict. Not only was the external world a threat, but now someone within her inner circle might be playing a dangerous game of their own. Meanwhile, whispers of Angela's maneuvering began to reach higher levels in the global business ecosystem. Some partners admired her decisiveness. Others wondered whether the canceled deal and her bold tactics signaled instability. The ripple effect was growing, touching corners of the market she hadn't directly engaged with yet. Every move she made would now be scrutinized not only by competitors and investors but also by an audience waiting for any sign of misstep. Angela knew that her next steps had to be invisible yet decisive, strategic yet unpredictable. She convened a high-priority internal briefing, carefully vetting every attendee. Every email, every phone call, every communication from this point forward had to be secured. She set in motion a series of contingency plans, each one anticipating multiple scenarios, financial, legal, and reputational. Even in the quiet moments, the pressure weighed heavily. Angela thought of Richard and the other executives who had underestimated her. They were no longer just rivals, they were forces actively testing her limits. Every calculation she had made, every preparation, was about to be challenged in ways that could escalate far beyond her initial expectations. The tension reached a breaking point when Lila handed her an anonymous note slipped under the door. "Not everything is as it seems. Watch who smiles the widest." Angela read it slowly, considering the layers of meaning. Someone inside the company, or perhaps someone on the other side, was playing a game within a game. The stakes were no longer just about money or contracts. They were about trust, perception, and the ability to anticipate human behavior under extreme pressure. The city outside her office window was alive with energy, oblivious to the invisible battlefield playing out behind boardroom doors. Angela felt the weight of expectation, not just her own but of everyone watching. Investors, employees, competitors, and the media were all part of a web she had to navigate, each strand capable of snapping if handled incorrectly. As night fell, the situation crystallized into a tense, almost cinematic tableau. Angela and her team plotting, analyzing, anticipating. Her competitors scrambling, desperate to regain control, and an unknown factor, a leak, a spy, or perhaps even a misjudged ally, lurking in the shadows. The tension was suffocating, the stakes unprecedented, and the outcome impossible to predict. Angela leaned back in her chair, eyes focused, mind working through probabilities. She understood that the next few hours, or even minutes, could change the trajectory of her company, her reputation, and her career. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one had fully prepared for, a moment that would test not just strategy, but instinct, courage, and the ability to anticipate the unpredictable. Every indicator pointed to one conclusion: the story was far from over. The canceled $700 million deal had set the first act in motion. The anonymous warnings, the leak, the investor scrutiny, and the rival company's desperation were all threads in a complex, high-stakes web. Angela Chin was no longer just a CEO, she was the central figure in a game that could shift the balance of power, and the world was watching with bated breath. And in that charged silence, one truth was undeniable. The next move she made would either consolidate her power, or ignite a storm that no one could control. Here's the climax section of your story, resolving the main conflicts while including a final twist to keep it suspenseful and engaging for YouTube. The day had arrived. Angela Chin walked into the boardroom with a calm confidence that belied the storm brewing around her. Weeks of tension, speculation, and maneuvering had all led to this moment. Every email, every leaked document, every whispered rumor had been calculated, anticipated, and integrated into her plan. She knew the rival company would make a move, but she was ready to turn it into their undoing. Richard and his team were already seated, their faces a mix of arrogance, desperation, and thinly veiled fear. They had come expecting her to be rattled, to make a reactive decision, to stumble under pressure. But Angela was nothing if not deliberate. As she began to speak, her voice was measured, precise, and commanding. She reminded them of the canceled deal, the clauses she had highlighted, and the assumptions they had made about her abilities. Then, with a quiet but unmistakable shift, she revealed that her team had anticipated the leak and the anonymous warnings. Every potential threat had been accounted for. Even the internal breach they had discovered? It had been a controlled test, a deliberate misdirection designed to flush out any remaining vulnerabilities in the company's defenses. The rival executives froze, realizing that they had been reacting to a scenario Angela had already mastered. Angela's next move was surgical. She presented a new framework for collaboration, one that offered benefits to the rival company but only under conditions that preserved her company's authority and minimized risk. Every clause, every incentive, and every stipulation had been crafted with precision. It wasn't just a negotiation, it was a demonstration of strategy, intelligence, and foresight on a scale that stunned everyone in the room. The rival team tried to push back, but each objection was anticipated. Angela responded not with anger, but with clarity, turning every counterpoint into an opportunity to reinforce her company's position. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Angela had not only neutralized the threat but had reasserted control in a way that left no room for doubt. Outside the boardroom, the media and analysts who had speculated endlessly were now scrambling to rewrite their narratives. Angela Chen was no longer just a black female CEO who had canceled a massive deal. She was the strategist who had outmaneuvered not just one company, but the assumptions, biases, and expectations of an entire industry. But just when it seemed the story had reached its peak, the final twist arrived. Angela's phone buzzed again, this time with a direct message from an unknown source. "You won the battle, but the war has just begun. Watch who follows you home." Angela didn't flinch. She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that only comes from someone who has anticipated every possibility, including this one. The city outside glittered like a field of potential, and she knew that while today had ended in victory, the challenges ahead would be just as intense, just as unpredictable. The canceled deal had become a story of strategy, power, and resilience, but the narrative wasn't over. As she left the building, the weight of her decisions settled over her. The rival company had been outsmarted, her internal vulnerabilities had been exposed and controlled, and her team had seen firsthand the depth of her leadership. Yet the final message lingered, a reminder that even the most decisive victories carried shadows, and even the most meticulous strategies could be challenged in ways no one anticipated. Angela stepped into the night, confident but alert, aware that the story was far from finished. She had proven her brilliance, her courage, and her ability to turn bias and underestimation into advantage. But the next move, in a world this complex and unpredictable, would always be waiting. The climax had arrived, yes, but the true game, the one of influence, perception, and human ambition, was just beginning. And in that quiet tension, one truth remained undeniable. Angela Chen was a force no one could ignore, a strategist whose brilliance had rewritten the rules, and a presence that would leave the corporate world, and everyone who had underestimated her, watching, guessing, and waiting for her next move. If you want, I can also create a final epilogue segment for YouTube that teases the next chapter, highlights her legacy, and leaves viewers on a cliffhanger for potential follow-up content. Perfect for audience engagement and SEO optimization. Do you want me to do that? Angela Chen walked into the boardroom with a calm confidence that belied the storm brewing around her. Weeks of tension, speculation, and maneuvering had all led to this moment. Every email, every leaked document, every whispered rumor had been calculated, anticipated, and integrated into her plan. She knew the rival company would make a move, but she was ready to turn it into their undoing. Richard and his team were already seated, their faces a mix of arrogance, desperation, and thinly veiled fear. They had come expecting her to be rattled, to make a reactive decision, to stumble under pressure. But Angela was nothing if not deliberate. As she began to speak, her voice was measured, precise, and commanding. She reminded them of the canceled deal, the clauses she had highlighted, and the assumptions they had made about her abilities. Then, with a quiet but unmistakable shift, she revealed that her team had anticipated the leak and the anonymous warnings. Every potential threat had been accounted for. Even the internal breach they had discovered? It had been a controlled test, a deliberate misdirection designed to flush out any remaining vulnerabilities in the company's defenses. The rival executives froze, realizing that they had been reacting to a scenario Angela had already mastered. Angela's next move was surgical. She presented a new framework for collaboration, one that offered benefits to the rival company but only under conditions that preserved her company's authority and minimized risk. Every clause, every incentive, and every stipulation had been crafted with precision. It wasn't just a negotiation, it was a demonstration of strategy, intelligence, and foresight on a scale that stunned everyone in the room. The rival team tried to push back, but each objection was anticipated. Angela responded not with anger, but with clarity, turning every counterpoint into an opportunity to reinforce her company's position. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Angela had not only neutralized the threat but had reasserted control in a way that left no room for doubt. Outside the boardroom, the media and analysts who had speculated endlessly were now scrambling to rewrite their narratives. Angela Chen was no longer just a black female CEO who had canceled a massive deal. She was the strategist who had outmaneuvered not just one company, but the assumptions, biases, and expectations of an entire industry. But just when it seemed the story had reached its peak, the final twist arrived. Angela's phone buzzed again, this time with a direct message from an unknown source. "You won the battle, but the war has just begun. Watch who follows you home." Angela didn't flinch. She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that only comes from someone who has anticipated every possibility, including this one. The city outside glittered like a field of potential, and she knew that while today had ended in victory, the challenges ahead would be just as intense, just as unpredictable. The canceled deal had become a story of strategy, power, and resilience, but the narrative wasn't over. As she left the building, the weight of her decisions settled over her. The rival company had been outsmarted, her internal vulnerabilities had been exposed and controlled, and her team had seen firsthand the depth of her leadership. Yet the final message lingered, a reminder that even the most decisive victories carried shadows, and even the most meticulous strategies could be challenged in ways no one anticipated. Angela stepped into the night, confident but alert, aware that the story was far from finished. She had proven her brilliance, her courage, and her ability to turn bias and underestimation into advantage. But the next move, in a world this complex and unpredictable, would always be waiting. The climax had arrived, yes, but the true game, the one of influence, perception, and human ambition, was just beginning. And in that quiet tension, one truth remained undeniable. Angela Chen was a force no one could ignore, a strategist whose brilliance had rewritten the rules, and a presence that would leave the corporate world, and everyone who had underestimated her, watching, guessing, and... In the days that followed the climactic negotiation, the world began to understand the full scope of Angela Chen's brilliance. What had started as a cancelled $700 million deal had evolved into a masterclass of strategy, foresight, and resilience. Investors, analysts, and competitors were no longer focused solely on the money lost. They were examining how Angela had turned what seemed like a setback into a defining victory. Her name became synonymous with intelligence, calculated risk, and leadership that challenged every assumption the corporate world had about her. Inside her company, the atmosphere shifted. Employees who had watched the tense weeks unfold now carried a renewed sense of respect and confidence. Her team realized that Angela's decisions were never impulsive. They were deliberate, built on careful observation, planning, and anticipation of every possible variable. Even the junior staff who had questioned the initial move now saw the method behind her strategy. There was a newfound energy in the office, a quiet pride that came from knowing they worked under a leader who could navigate chaos without losing composure. Marcus, her CFO, approached her one morning, a rare smile on his face. "Angela, I have to admit, I was worried at first. But seeing how you handled everything, you didn't just protect the company, you elevated it. People are talking about our resilience. Our credibility has grown exponentially." Angela nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement but already thinking about the future. "Credibility is earned every day," she said. "Today's victory is only part of the story. We can't rest because the world will always test us. But we've proven that our foundation is strong." Lila, her assistant, reflected on the journey in her own way. She had been with Angela through every tense moment, every whispered rumor, and every high-stakes decision. "I think the most impressive thing," she said, "is how you've handled everything without letting ego or anger get in the way. You've turned underestimation into strategy. That's rare." Angela smiled faintly, but her mind was already moving to the next set of challenges. Leadership, she knew, was not a destination. It was a constant journey of adaptation and foresight. Meanwhile, the rival company was forced to reassess its position. Richard and his team had initially thought they could pressure Angela into a reactive move, but her foresight had left them exposed. Publicly, they maintained a neutral stance, but internally, the damage was significant. Analysts noted that their overconfidence had been exploited, and whispers of mismanagement began to circulate. Angela's decision had not only protected her company, it had shifted the balance of power in her favor, subtly but irrevocably. Despite the victory, Angela knew that the corporate world was never static. The anonymous warning she had received during the climax remained a reminder that challenges could emerge from unexpected places. Competitors might regroup, investors might question her moves, and unforeseen crises could arise. But Angela also recognized that her preparation, foresight, and ability to anticipate human behavior gave her a unique advantage. She had turned unpredictability into a tool, not a threat. Over the following weeks, the ripple effects of the canceled deal continued to unfold. International partners reached out, not to question her decision, but to understand the strategy behind it. They wanted insight into how she had navigated the negotiation, how she had anticipated potential leaks, and how she had maintained composure under extreme pressure. Angela's influence began to extend beyond her own company, shaping conversations about negotiation, leadership, and resilience across the global business community. There was also a personal dimension to the aftermath. Angela reflected on the assumptions that had been made about her, the casual dismissal, the whispers, the nickname. They had been hurtful in the moment, but they had also revealed something important. People often underestimate those they cannot immediately define. Angela had taken that underestimation and transformed it into a strategic advantage. She recognized that bias and expectation were not just social issues. They were variables in the real-world challenges she faced daily. And by mastering them, she had redefined the narrative for herself and her company. The leak that had caused so much concern was traced back to a junior employee who had unintentionally shared information. Angela handled the situation not with anger but with clarity, using it as an opportunity to strengthen internal protocols and mentorship. The employee remained part of the team, but the incident became a teaching moment, illustrating the importance of vigilance, trust, and accountability. It was a reminder that even in victory, leadership required patience, empathy, and guidance. Angela also reflected on the human dynamics of the rival executives. They had underestimated her, not maliciously, but because they had allowed assumptions and biases to cloud judgment. Their errors became lessons for her team, proof that intelligence, preparation, and emotional awareness could overcome arrogance and complacency. She shared these insights in internal briefings, emphasizing not just the tactical victories but the broader lessons about perception, respect, and strategy. Media coverage began to celebrate Angela as a model of leadership in the modern business world. Articles highlighted her ability to navigate complex negotiations, her global perspective, and her commitment to fairness and integrity. Yet, Angela remained grounded. She understood that attention could be fleeting, and true influence was measured by consistency, results, and the ability to inspire those around her. Even the initial insult, the nickname that had stung so sharply at the start of this story, lost its power over time. Angela reframed it internally, recognizing that it had become a catalyst for action, not a source of anger. The lesson was clear. Challenges, slights, and obstacles were opportunities to demonstrate character, competence, and resilience. That realization, perhaps more than any single victory, defined her as a leader. By the end of the month, the company had stabilized. Contracts were renegotiated on favorable terms, international partnerships strengthened, and investor confidence returned. Angela's leadership had transformed a high-stakes threat into a platform for long-term growth, credibility, and influence. The canceled $700 million deal was no longer viewed as a loss. It was a turning point that had set the tone for every future negotiation. And yet, even as the story closed its chapters, there was a lingering sense of anticipation. The anonymous warning from the climax served as a reminder that in business, as in life, victory is never absolute. Challenges would continue to arise, unexpected variables would test her judgment, and human behavior would remain unpredictable. But Angela had proven something essential, that preparation, insight, and courage could turn uncertainty into opportunity. As she stood in her office one evening, looking out over the city lights, Angela reflected on the journey. She thought about the assumptions she had faced, the biases she had overcome, and the calculated risks that had shaped her path. She considered the lessons she had learned about trust, strategy, and the importance of observation. And she understood that her story was not just about a single deal, a single negotiation, or a single victory. It was about resilience, intelligence, and the ability to navigate the world on one's own terms. Angela turned to her team, who were quietly finishing their day. "Remember this," she said softly but with conviction. "Success isn't just about winning deals. It's about seeing what others don't see, preparing for what others ignore, and acting with integrity when the pressure is highest. That is how we define who we are." The team nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. They had witnessed brilliance in action, but more importantly, they had learned that leadership required more than intelligence. It required patience, empathy, and courage under pressure. As the city below continued to hum with life, Angela Chen knew that her influence would continue to grow. Her name had become a benchmark for leadership, strategy, and resilience, but she remained focused on the next challenge, the next negotiation, and the next opportunity to apply the lessons she had learned. And in that quiet resolve, the story found its natural ending. The $700 million deal, the insults, the leaks, and the rival executives had all played their part. Angela had navigated every twist and turn, overcome every obstacle, and emerged not just victorious but stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the uncertainties of the future. The story closed, but its lessons remained. Underestimation can become advantage, preparation turns chaos into opportunity, and leadership is measured not just by decisions, but by the ability to inspire, protect, and anticipate in a world that constantly challenges you. Angela Chin had proven all of these truths, and the world had watched, learned, and remembered. And as the lights of the city reflected in her office window, there was one final, quiet acknowledgement. In a world full of assumptions and expectations, Angela had rewritten the rules, and in doing so, she had become unstoppable. This wraps up the story fully, resolving the main conflicts, closing subplots, providing key takeaways, and leaving a lasting impression for viewers while keeping SEO-friendly keywords naturally integrated.